Welcome to today's webinar on guiding publishers on sustainable supply chain. I'm Brian O'Leary, Executive Director of the Book Industry Study Group, and we're fortunate today to have a couple of sustainability experts from the Woodland Group to talk about their approach to sustainable delivery, particularly in the transportation sector. Before we get started, I just want to remind everybody that we have allowed time for questions and answers. The best way to get those put in front of us is to add them as you go to the Q&A tab. It's on the bottom, typically, of the Zoom interface that you're working with. You can also put it in chat. It's a little bit harder to track there, so we ask that you use the Q&A, but either one we'll be monitoring throughout and raising the questions toward the end of the presentations. Today, we're fortunate to have two folks from Woodland talking directly about their work. The first to kick us off is Sam Warren, who's Sustainability Manager with the Woodland Group. And he'll be followed by Craig Wilson, who's the Digital Experience Executive. I was teasing him last week that he probably has one of the cooler titles at Woodland. But in any event, they're both going to be talking about their aspects of the work today. We also have joining us two folks, Adrian Blackman and Susie Scally, who'll be on hand to answer questions that may be a little bit outside of Sam or Craig's expertise, although it's hard to imagine that anything will befuddle them. With that, I'm going to welcome Sam and ask you to kick us off.
Sure. Thank you very much, Brian. Hello, everyone. Thank you for the introduction. I'm Sam Warren. As Brian said, I'm Sustainability Manager here at Woodland. So I think to kick things off, I'll do a bit of a brief overview of who Woodland are and sort of what we do. So Woodland Group has been operating since 1988. Today, we're one of the largest privately owned global logistics providers. We have locations across the US, Ireland, Asia, UK and mainland Europe. We've got varying specialities across different parts of the business, and that includes air freight through to ocean freight, rail, warehousing and fulfillment. We operate across a number of sectors, publishing being one of the main ones, but also looking at automotive, food and beverage, music industry, amongst others. So with that being said, today, we're going to talk a little bit about ESG, carbon reporting, sustainability, what that looks like in the transport sector. Now, the phrase ESG is becoming more and more of a hot word, particularly on our side of the pond, actually. And it's a really good way that we can kind of look at corporate sustainability, what that means, what that is. And by breaking that down, we can look at the core factors that can build up to make a company more or perhaps less sustainable. So looking through those three factors, environmental to start with, looking at your company's impact on the natural environment, carbon emissions, energy resource efficiency, waste management, those sort of things. Social looks more at the impact on your employees, how you treat them, human rights, labour, ethics, and community engagement, what you do to operate outside of just your business, what you do with the local communities that might surround your sites. And finally, you've got governance. Governance is your compliance piece. It looks at what your board of directors have overview of and expectations over. The lights just went off in here, excuse me. It also gives, it also talks a bit more about anti-corruption and how the company operates in terms of transparency. So like I say, today we're going to be focusing on the environmental factor mainly, looking at carbon emissions, carbon reporting, and how that process works. So why does it matter to look at ESG? Why does it matter to look at the environment? Well, there's a variety of factors, both internal and external, for why a company might consider these things. It could be staff expectations, it could be personal values of some of the board of directors, perhaps. It could be risk management. On the external point of view, it could be compliance, the demands coming from clients. That's certainly something that we've started to factor in as one of the reasons that we are operating and looking at these things. Also, there's external benefits. There's brand reputation and credibility. There's looking at how your employees are engaged in what you're doing and what they are doing within their workplace. So these things start to come together, and this idea of environmental considerations and sustainability within the corporate sector start to kind of play more and more of a key role. So I thought we'd start by sort of covering, in case anyone hasn't seen this before, what carbon reporting is, environmental reporting, and how we break that down. So typically, for environmental reporting, we're looking at a number of things, but we're breaking it down into three core areas, and we call that scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. The reason we do that is because different areas of the business can have different impacts at different points. So it could be that you're looking at your business travel, how that has an impact on your emissions. It could be that you can waste, and all of those things, they are indirect in your scope 3. What that means is they're upstream of anything that you do. They're the things that have actual impact on your company. But then looking more directly at your scope 1 and your scope 2. Scope 1 is things like the emissions coming from your facilities directly, or any vehicles that you might own. For example, Woodland has a fleet of vehicles here in the UK, and as a result, that falls into our scope 1. But then you might have an operational facility that might be processing plastic, say, or it could be, in this case, something to do with publishing. That counts as your scope 1. Whereas your scope 2 is your utilities, effectively, your electricity and your gas, things that have indirect impacts on your company, but they are things that you buy from, say, the national grid. And finally, looking at downstream activities over there on the right-hand side of this slide, that's things that happen after you've sold your product. So if you're selling mobile phones, perhaps it might be how those products are used, the emissions that come from that. Car industries use this a lot when they look at what happens to their vehicles after they're sold. So breaking that down just a tad more, and just to cover exactly what went over there, scope 1, direct emissions from your owned or controlled assets. For example, the fuel that you burn when running your fleet. Scope 2, emissions that come indirectly when you purchase electricity or gas from a main grid. And scope 3 is everything else, all of the things that happen before the goods come to you and after you sell them. So what does that look like in terms of an environmental report that a company might produce that looks at all scope 1, 2, and 3? It would probably be something like this, which looks, I suppose, a little bit full on. But what we're doing here is we are looking at every area of the business. We are doing a calculation to turn it from kilowatts of energy or kilograms of paper packaging used, and we're converting that into a CO2 equivalent figure. CO2 equivalent is used because there's lots of different emissions that are released. When you burn diesel, for example, there's 5 different types of emissions that come from that, different greenhouse gases, but it's very difficult to convey that simply. So we use CO2 equivalent to convert all of those different types of greenhouse gases into one figure, CO2 equivalent. And we can measure that in kilograms, or we can measure that in pounds. That's the metric of the imperial. Typically, the system that is used globally is the metric system, it's the kilograms. But as companies in the US, we like to try and provide that in pounds. So this is what this might look like. Now, you'll see that I've drawn a red square around downstream vehicle fleet emissions. The reason for that is because if Woodland was your transport provider, that would be the bit that we'd have an impact on. That would be where some of the services that we might offer would fall into, and that's how you'd measure it within your company. You might already be doing this, or you might not. And this is to make it clear that that's where we, as a freight forwarder, as your logistics provider, or any other company that does that, would fit into your scope 1, 2, and 3. So that's what we're going to look at a little bit more at today. So when we're talking really specifically about transport carbon emissions, the overall methodology for all carbon reporting is something called the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. Now that came about out of the United Nations. There's a whole lot of work to try and develop this idea of turning things into CO2 equivalent. But then they realized that although it works really well for looking at your scope 1 and 2, your energy or the things that you consume directly on your sites, it gets really, really difficult when you start to look at your scope 3, when you're talking about providers that you might use as a business. So they started to generate these subcategories to calculate emissions that are relevant to certain areas. Now, something then came about called GLEC, the Global Logistics Emissions Council. Now, they are specifically focused at carbon calculations for the logistics sector. And as you can see on screen, that covers pretty much all transport modes. And also, if there's a shunt taking place at a port, it also looks at the emissions involved in that. So this is something that we've put a lot of work into, and we've developed a tool that follows the GLEC protocol, which basically means that if you were to do your transport carbon emissions to calculate your downstream within your scope 3, this would be the process that you should use. And it means you can almost drag and drop the carbon reporting that we might do or another company might do for you into your report, as long as it fits within the GLEC framework. So that's an overview of what this means, how this fits into the context of of operations and carbon reporting. So next I'm going to move on to sort of the more interesting, I suppose, for me at least, part, which is what do these look like? What do carbon reports for transport sectors, for looking at your road and your rail and all your logistics movements, what does that look like? For us, for what we've sort of developed, it looks something like this. And this is, one example. Different logistics providers have done this differently, but this is the way that we found the most beneficial. Now, I'm sure this looks like a lot of sort of information on one page. So I'm going to try and go through this slide by slide and graph by graph to explain exactly what we're showing on screen. So first of all, looking in the top left, we have shipment count. So as you probably know, actually, most shipments that you do moving goods from A to B will have different modes of transports involved. So in order to account for that and to make it easy to understand, typically you break it up by what we call the main transport mode. So say you're moving goods from China to the US, it might start at the very origin at a factory or paper mill, something like that. It would be driven to a port, perhaps. Then at that port, it would jump onto a vessel that would do that longest part of the journey across the globe and get you somewhere into the US at US port. From that point, it might go by road or rail and transport to the final destination. So to make it easy to understand all of that, we monitor and calculate things based on the main transport mode. That means that we're calculating that pre and post leg, that beginning and that end shorter journey, but we break it up to make it easier to understand by the main transport mode. So you can see here on screen, we're doing that month by month, and we're showing just a really top level overview of what it looks like per month. This is also a demo account here, so you can see that this client had a steep incline in sea shipments in the middle of the year, and that slightly tailed off towards the end. So going across one on that first graph I showed, we're looking at that CO2 figure, the number I talked about at the start there, as a total figure, and that T means tons, metric tons. Now, something that Woodland is looking to do is to offer the imperial and the metric system here. And when we get into look at Woodland Online, you'll see that's sort of where we're starting to implement that slowly. But right now, what we're able to do is in the metric system. So as you can see, again, we're using that main transport mode, but also, of course, calculating the pre and the post leg for every shipment. And you can see that we're doing it by something called WTW there. So you've got CO2 equivalent total tons well to wheel. That's what WTW stands for. Now, like we talked about sort of the scope 1, 2, and 3, we have to think about that for transport too. So what happens before we get the fuel into the vehicle? That's where well to wheel comes in. So what this means is you do a calculation behind the scenes, and that's nothing that really needs to be shown, that calculates the moment the fuel is pulled out of the ground as crude oil, goes through refinement, it's transported to a fuel depot somewhere, and then it enters the vehicle, and then it's burned off through the end. That means well to wheel. So all the way from beginning to end. Now we account for that in our emission reports, and we encourage any company that's looking at doing this to do the same, to account for that full life cycle of the fuel. So again, as I said, month by month, we're seeing different emissions. As we go across one more over to the far right hand side of that initial page that I showed, we're looking at something called average G CO2 by ton kilometer. And what that means is how much CO2 equivalent was created to move 1 ton of goods 1 kilometer in distance. And it's something called an intensity ratio. And it's something that we can use to look at different transport modes and understand a similar value for each one. And as you can see on here, air has quite a high amount of emissions per ton kilometer, whereas something like sea freight has a bit of a lower one. Moving down once more to the bottom left-hand side of that initial table that I showed, we've got an emissions breakdown. Now, you know how I mentioned earlier on that diesel has 5 different types of emissions that are released when you burn it. Here you can see each one of those emissions, and these are pretty much standard for most modes of transport, whether it's ocean, air, road, rail. We can see each type of emission, but as I mentioned, this is where it gets a bit complicated, and it explains why we use that CO2 equivalent figure. And that red box there is that total number of emissions per month shown. And also you can see on the screen, of course, we've got the number of shipments that take place, the amount of weight of goods that are moved. But like I say, that figure there, that's the one that companies that work with us will take out and pull into their own carbon reports, because it's the total figure they need to account for and tell companies that they're reporting on. And finally, just going to the last part of that page is the CO2e by route. So some companies like to understand which routes, if they're running 10 or 12 different routes across the globe moving their goods, which ones cause the most emissions and which ones might cause the least. And obviously I've grayed out the area there to show what the routes might be, but you'd see, say, from Milan to Chicago there, and you'd understand that that per route is the amount of emissions created in total. But here we can also filter that and look at different bits of information. So we might even look at consignee or consignor and understand which customers or which clients are causing those most emissions. And we can even start to think about how that works with titles of books. So going back to the full thing, I've gone through every step there, and now hopefully I've given a bit of a clarity on what we're looking at here. It's a full breakdown of all of the emissions in every possible way that your logistics transports cause. So that's something that Woodland offers, this example of what we provide to clients. But one of the other things that we do using the same tool and the same calculations is we can do it as a hypothetical shipment. So say a client comes to us and says, okay, I'm considering moving my goods from Yantian to Chicago, but also I might do it from Milan to Chicago, trying to decide which one's most appropriate for their goods. So they're factoring in cost there, time, but also they might be factoring in emissions because one of their customers or clients or someone that they're working with is really keen to see that shown. So that's something that we can do. We can compare the two. And if a customer tells us, okay, it's going to be a 40-foot container, it's going to weigh 22 tons, it's going to have about 50,000 books on it, we can then break it down and say, okay, well, if you went from, as shown here, Yantian to Chicago by ocean freight, that would be 104.4 grams of carbon per book. But if you did it from Milan to Chicago, it would be 81.8. So that means that the customer can say, okay, well, it's going to cost me maybe more if I was doing it in Milan, but then it's going to be less emissions. So you can start to see where the idea of ESG factors into that decision-making process. So that's sort of a deep dive into carbon emissions and how we report on those. But that's sort of the first step almost in this idea of sustainable supply chains. So once we understand, and measure our emissions, we can then start to think about, okay, well, how can we reduce? What can we do to make changes? And that's where the next steps start to come into this. So there's a few things here to think about. Green warehousing. Woodland's made some commitments and actually made a lot of progress around our warehousing, particularly actually in the UK at the moment. So solar panels, we might look at electric forklifts as opposed to sort of propane or diesel. We can also look at reducing the amount of plastic that comes when we're wrapping pallets. And there's plenty more that we're doing, just as examples of what companies can do within their supply chain to think about reducing emissions there. We can also think about things like alternative transport modes, maybe choosing to consolidate goods with potentially other publishers, for example. And all of those things, they have an impact in changing how much emissions are created, but still getting goods from A to B. The catch there, I suppose, can be that it might affect your lead times. It might affect, that process that you've got within your company of moving your goods from A to B. So it's things you have to factor in. And I talk to a lot of clients on a daily basis talking about, okay, I want to do this, but it's going to have this impact, and that's what they're trying to weigh out themselves. And we can support in that. And that's kind of where logistics is starting to move forward. And finally, if a client says, okay, I need to get my goods from A to B, I need to get it from the UK to the US, say, it needs to go by air freight because we need it here in 2 days' time, but I want to reduce emissions. Well, that's where this idea of sustainable fuels are starting to come from. I'm going to touch on that a little bit more later on in the presentation. So doing a little bit more of a deeper dive into the first step of that, the idea of green warehousing. What does that really look like? Well, here's some examples of things that Woodland's doing, but also things that we're seeing within the sort of logistics market. So things like recycled paper as cushioning material for goods. That's starting to come through now, replacing things like bubble wrap or polystyrene as a way to move goods without the use of single-use plastics. Similarly, pallet wrap is something that's starting to change now. So we actually did a lot of work, Woodland, looking at different types of pallet wrap and understanding which ones were the most environmentally friendly. And what we ended up coming to was a particular type of pallet wrap that has a more stretchy polymer than a typical wrap would. And what that meant is that we could actually stretch it up to 30% more per roll. It means the goods are held tighter, less likely to fall off, but also meant that we were using far less single-use plastic per pallet. And overall, that meant about 30% reduction in single-use plastic usage. But also, it turns out that type of wrap was made of 30% recycled material. So you're starting to see where a simple change started to have really big impact in the amount of plastic that we're using as a company. We can talk about that and pass those emission savings on to our customers. Waste analysis, looking at the waste that the site's producing and implementing the right recycling schemes can have a massive impact in the amount of the amount of waste going to landfill. And the lower amount of waste going to landfill, the less emissions that are created, because it means the more is being recycled and reused. And the light's gone off again. Finally, then we've got on the bottom there, corrugated card pallets. So wood pallets, of course, the typical route to go down, but something that we're finding is that customers and particularly publishers are starting to look at cardboard corrugated pallets. What this means is far less wood use. It means it can be made of something like a recycled card material. So it means that it's lighter, it means that it's doing the job it still needs to do, but with far less emissions. So these are just examples of things that we're starting to see coming through in the market. Moving across there, looking more, I suppose, at that social point that I mentioned earlier, looking at local employers, looking at training your staff in-house, and having staff on site that might be leading those training sessions can be really beneficial and have really good impact on your staff. And finally, then going down to that bottom right-hand side of the screen there, looking at that environmental point again. I mentioned earlier, switching over to electric forklifts can have a big impact for a logistics provider like ourselves, and we can pass those emission savings on to our customers. Equally, LED lighting, and the reason I put smart LED lighting there is because of motion sensors, like the one in this room, which mean the light keep turning off. But also things like LEDs that monitor the ambient light outside the building, and then they can dim and brighten the lights inside a warehouse depending on how bright it is. We've done that at one of our sites in the UK actually, and that's meant a massive savings in terms of energy usage per year, which is fantastic to see. And going on to that point below there, what's the next step in that process? Well, it's to put solar on the roof, because then you're generating zero carbon, zero emission energy, and then you're using it as efficiently as you can on that site. And that's something that we're doing at one of our sites in the UK. Finally, bottom point there. This is, I suppose, for lots of companies, but certainly true in the logistics sector. As COVID happened and as we went through that process, companies realized how much they relied on the data centers to send their emails, to document their files. And with more people working from home, that was becoming more and more evident. So switching over to renewable energy powered data centers dropped the amount of emissions being produced dramatically, but also it was a fairly easy switch, and it's something that Woodland did, and it's proven to be very beneficial when we look at our own scope 1, 2, and 3 carbon reports. Next over there then is to this idea of optimization within the supply chain. So it's that third point along in that initial graph I showed. So what does that mean? Well, like I said, consolidation is a really key point there. If you can move your goods in amongst others, then you're reducing the number of shipments and the number of journeys happening before they even do. And that can be really beneficial in reducing the emissions of your own transports. Next down there, like I mentioned again earlier, is this alternative transport mode idea. So opting for modes of transports that might be more efficient, might just naturally use less energy to get goods from A to B. And finally, this is something that Woodland's actually looking at heavily, and I think it's quite an interesting one. It's like this idea of limiting the middleman. So when goods go from A to B, there might be a number of changes over of those goods. So there might be some shunts taking place to break down a pallet, take it apart, put it onto another pallet, half of it, and then put the other half onto another pallet, then rewrapping. If you can reduce the number of times that might be happening, then you can reduce the amount of emissions being created, less packaging waste, fewer miles traveled between the middlemen. And it's certainly something that we're trying to do, is offer that full service A to B. And we certainly do offer that service. And finally, getting over to the last point that I showed, alternative fuels. This is an interesting one, and it's really starting to sort of gain speed across the globe. There's different fuels that are becoming apparent for different modes of transport, and I've shown 3 here that are the most spoken about within our sector, and that's road, air, and ocean. So for road freight, actually probably for all 3, the eventual solution is hydrogen. It is the way that most seem to see the future of transport going. But right now, even if the technology to make a hydrogen powered HGV is there and ready, the infrastructure and actually the way to make green hydrogen, which is hydrogen made from renewable energy, isn't quite ready yet. And it probably won't be for maybe, say, another 3 to 5, maybe even 10 years, depending on where you are on the globe and what that looks like to you. So in the meantime, there's a couple of different types of fuels that are starting to show up. For road, a really interesting one is something called HVO, which is hydro-treated vegetable oil. Particularly, actually, I should mention there's different types of HVO. Some come from just flat out brand new plants are being grown to create the fuel. But the better choice is to go with oils and HVO fuels that come from waste food. So that might be waste vegetable fats or oils, that might be even some waste food and some animal fats. And by processing that, refining that type of fuel and adding different additives to it, it can run in a current diesel engine with no changes needed and offer 88% less emissions per mile. So a massive drop in emissions without having to change the vehicle. And so for a lot of companies in the logistics space, it's seen as a really good middle choice as long as it's coming from sustainable feedstocks, which means that idea of the waste food being the source of the fuel. So I'm going to skip. We've got CNG, which is another option for road, but slightly less in use, I should say, and certainly less, in my opinion, interesting than HVO. Switching over then to air freight, sustainable aviation fuel, very similar style of fuel to HVO, also coming from waste food stocks. It similarly offers about 85 to 90% reductions in emissions. And we're starting to see actually at Heathrow Airport is at the moment globally the sort of the top airport that is sort of using that fuel. And we're starting to see it more and more with some of the big sort of air freight and airspace sort of providers. I think it's really going to, I think, grow over the next 3 to 5 years in that sort of build up to the switch over to hydrogen. And finally, far on the right there, ocean freight. So again, similar type of fuel, sustainable marine fuel, also coming from waste food stocks, but the marine fuel option. Also offering a similar amount of reduction in emissions and equally still able to be used in the same jet engine, sort of ocean liner as you would use the typical marine fuel. LNG is another option that's sort of starting to show up a lot in ocean freight and has been used for a while now. I know that sort of CMA and some of the other big guys have been putting more and more LNG vessels into operation across their global fleet. And I think actually at the moment, CMA actually in particular maybe have 10 or 15 running. But like I say, that's sort of a midterm solution, still creating a fair chunk of emissions, even if it's less than typical marine fuel. So long-term, hydrogen's that solution. So that kind of gives, hopefully, an interesting and sort of top-level overview of what sustainable logistics looks like, where Woodland's going, and certainly where the industry as a whole is starting to move. And we're really trying at Woodland to be at the forefront of that, trying to make sure that we're offering everything that is available possibly within the logistics space. But a couple of points just to note before I let Craig take over and show some of the Woodland online capabilities. Woodlands is also operating sort of more as just general corporate sustainability and doing a few different things there. So EcoVardis is starting to be used more and more as a means to analyze and assess the suppliers that a company uses. So actually a number of the companies that we work for using EcoVardis to assess whether or not they'll use their suppliers that might be using for 5 or 10 years. Woodland, thankfully, achieved a bronze rating last year within EcoVardis, which we're very proud of. We actually came in the top 3rd environmentally across all the companies that have been analysed. So that's something to note there. We're also joining the UN Global Compact, and that means that the UN SDGs, which are used to assess how the globe is moving towards a net zero future, we align with those, and we also align with 10 principles that include human rights, labour, environment, and anti-corruption. Next step down there, sustainability reporting. Next month, we're releasing our first full sustainability report as a company. So please do look out for that. And I'm sure, hopefully, you'll have some questions and you can reach out to me about that one. And finally, we are committed as a company, as a logistics provider, to reach net zero by 2050. And in order to go along with that, we'll also be setting our SBTI approved net zero targets, which basically means that they're approved by a third-party group. So I hope that's been interesting. I hope I haven't covered too much and given too much information at once. I'm going to pass over to Craig now. He's going to speak a little bit about Woodland Online and how the sort of carbon calculation tools that we offer are built into that. So I'll stop sharing my screen.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Craig Wilson, and I'm the Digital Experience Executive. And I just wanted to give you a quick insight to our online tracking capabilities surrounding the carbon calculator. So within our online system, we can capture data from booking points. We can raise a job reference. We have a lot of data in here with origin details all the way through to customers clearing deliveries. But as you can see in this screen on the far right hand side, we also capture the carbon emission calculation from port to port leg only within the system. And that is based in kilograms as well. And within this system, you can see that we've got the cargo descriptions, documentation we can also obtain, along with the carbon reporting that Sam Warren also mentioned earlier. And we can actually download that, and the customer can obtain it themselves and also store it within the system. So I'll just show you a quick, just downloading it. You can see in here that you have that available at any point of time, 24/7. Coming out of here within the documentation, this is another area where we store all of the documents for each shipment that we have on the file for you. So within here, again, we can go in and we can download the documentation required. So just as I just showed you there with the demo shipment, the carbon report is available for download. And lastly, within here as well, we have a live view ocean vessel tracking system, which we can capture data from origin port to destination port as well. So within here, we can actually track the vessel, and we can select the vessel as well. And we can see its routing, its current routing and its current positioning. And that allows us to have information for the customer, which will provide you with the vessel details, the origin and destination details, as well as the arrival dates and a breakdown of what's actually in that shipment for you. So as you can see in here, we have information such as the purchase order, the container details, and a brief description of what's in there, along with the weight and the volume of the goods. And I know it's a very quick and brief insight into the system, but that is the carbon side of it. We do have a lot more to show you, but that we can also catch up another time of that there. But thank you.
Thank you, Sam, and thank you, Craig. We have a few questions, and maybe I could start with one. Probably is best position for Sam, but Dennis was asking, what about rail shipments?
Is that in regards to alternative fuels?
I think it was really in the context of, do you measure the carbon impact
Yes.
of rail shipments as part of your thinking?
Yes, it does. I mean, yes, that's certainly something that we're looking to do. It's actually a little bit more at the early stages, interestingly, particularly for the sort of calculation tool that we use. But luckily, it's still included in the calculations, and it's certainly something we do. I think it's interesting because rail is starting to show up more and more as a solution. I know it's certainly used in the US quite a lot, and it actually produces around about 7 times fewer emissions per kilometre to move goods than road does. So it's a great solution if it's possible to be used, but rail networks don't go door to door. They only do those main leg of the journey. So it's only really for certain routes and certain legs we can use it. So we try to optimize as much as we can, and rail is one solution, particularly actually in Europe now, that's starting to be used more and more to reduce emissions and move slightly more away from rail freight, from road freight, sorry.
And Edson was asking, this is actually something I think we kicked around a little bit in our prep session, just saying that from his perspective, ESG has been made political. Do you see any pushback to either ESG strategies or goals, and how do you respond?
Yeah, I mean, so it's a shame that that's the case, and it seems that lots of companies are making commitments to this, and I think what we're seeing more and more, and there's been various studies done, is seeing that consumers want emission reductions. They want to buy more sustainable products. There was some really interesting studies done that showed actually in the US that products that are marketed or proven to be more sustainable than otherwise had about 8% more growth over the last 5 years in terms of profit margins and the amount of goods that are being bought and actually I suppose sold too. So I think that's really critical to recognize in this, is that ESG, you're right, unfortunately has become something that can be political at times, but ultimately it's probably here to stay. Consumers want it, and I think companies that are really embracing that and going on that journey, their suppliers, and actually on behalf of their customers, they're seeing real impacts and real sort of progress and success from that. So it's a shame it has, but no, ultimately we don't see too much major pushback. The one question, of course, is how much is it going to cost me to use alternative fuels or look at those solutions? And ultimately the answer is, how long's a piece of string? We don't know until we look into that more. And it actually, it comes down to what budget is available and what can we realistically and legitimately do now, and what could we maybe do in 5 years' time when solutions might be more widely available. And I think those two factors come into it a lot. I think companies look at cost and time as the two factors for why they might choose certain modes of transport or choose certain supply chain routes. And that third one, environment and carbon, is starting to come into it slowly and surely. It's sort of increasing in magnitude, particularly for global companies and global corporates, I suppose. But it's starting to filter down to the smaller and smaller. I think that's why there's so much interest in looking at this idea. And certainly from our point of view internally, it's not just the big corporations that we work with that are looking at this now. The smaller guys are opting to do it, either because they have to from a regulatory point of view, or just because they believe it's the right thing to do, or because that's what's expected from their clients.
And just to add to Sam's comments in response to the same question, the likes of electric cars was politicized. I think we've got to think more futuristically as to where the world is going, where products are going. And of course, whilst you would typically spend more money for an electric car nowadays, you only do that because you foresee the longer term savings with using and cleaner energy using the likes of an electric car up against our typical gas and petrol cars today.
Thanks, that's really helpful. Maybe this is a question to draw Craig into the conversation. You showed a mapping tool just briefly. Is that limited to just your shipments? Because I can't imagine that there are only 2 vessels on the ocean at any given time.
Yes, yeah. So it is limited to the vessels and the bookings that we have for that particular customer at that time. But we use marine traffic to pull that data through, and that's updated on a daily basis.
So it's kind of like GPS for ships.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. If you had 100 shipments on 100 different ships, then that map would show all 100 ships with your shipments.
Well, when I get 100 ships to worry about them, in the meantime, I'll leave it to you guys. Ken is asking, and maybe this is a question for any one of you. How does sustainable logistics compare quantitatively against logistics cost overall? I mean, and I guess the companion question is, how much more do you find companies are willing to pay for sustainable logistics? I might caution you that in a public environment like this, that's a dangerous question because pricing is not really our permitted topic. But maybe more generally, what are you seeing in terms of both the impact on overall costs and consumer or company willingness to pay?
I think a really good example here is that point that I made about green warehousing. That shrink wrap that we switched to meant that ultimately we were using 30% less overall. So we were buying 30% less rolls of shrink wrap per year, which ultimately meant that even if the product was 5% more expensive, we were saving 25% on what we would have been spending. So I think sustainability and perhaps just general efficiency have a crossover. And if you can find the right medium between those two things that works with what you're able to do as a business, then that's a sweet spot. And that's what we're operating in right now. And a lot of customers are starting to look at. Another good example is also things like solar. And Adrian touched on it, the idea of an electric car and that return on investment. If you put solar on a roof, if you have a certain amount of it that covers 50% of the usage of your site, then the other 50% might be able to be sold back to the grid. And in that case, then you're making a return on investment on what you're choosing to do. And I think that's where sustainability can work really well today, in terms of optimizing what you have, choosing to be more efficient, and then ultimately reducing costs there. So yeah, on the flip side to it costing more, it can also cost less.
Can you talk a little bit more about carbon intensity? Certainly the emissions per ton kilometer calculation. And how does that kind of affect how you think about shipments, but also how you want the publisher community to think about shipments?
Yeah. So what often happens is a publisher will come to me and say, okay, we've got your report, we've looked through it, we've done some research ourselves, and we've realized, maybe we want to reduce the amount of road freight or air freight that they're opting to go with. And in that case, then fine, of course, we can have a conversation and we'll work with you to see what we can do, get our account managers involved and see what is operationally possible if you've got your goods starting at point A and it's got to get to point B at the end of it. But as I sort of touched on, there's sort of environmental impact, carbon impact is one of, I think, 3 core things, and that idea of time and cost comes into it just as much. So if you can weigh out what it might do to your supply chain lead time and what that looks like, maybe you need if you're hoping to get your goods from the UK to the US in 6 days, then can you work with it being 6 weeks that it might take for ocean freight? And equally, if it's a less direct route to move goods from Asia to Europe, you could potentially do that via rail, but equally that might have a longer lead time than going by ocean. So all these factors need to be considered, and it's sort of part, I think, of a logistics provider now to weigh those up and help a customer in figuring out what is actually possible and what is potentially not now, but could be in a couple of years' time, perhaps.
Over recent years, we have seen where printers and publishers have got smarter. Many people at one point felt they had the need to receive the goods into their destination country prior to them getting to the final destination country, which may be outside of the continent. Over recent decades, the last 2 decades in particular, we have seen the progression of what we refer to as cross-trade. So whilst the printer may be based in China, I am based in the US, but the books actually need to go to the UK. We're no longer bringing those books from China to the US and then shipping them to the UK, which is obviously creating a great deal more emissions. We're taking it from China, dealing with the customer in the US, but shipping those products directly to the UK, to Europe, to elsewhere, not necessarily touching the country where the PO was placed. And that is certainly, from a cost standpoint, from an ESG standpoint, a much more efficient way to go.
And this may be best kept with you, Adrian, or we can at least start there. So Ken's adding a couple of different thoughts. One was the broad-based question of what happens for a publisher who can substantially reduce transportation emissions by producing locally, but then pays a premium on a per unit basis for doing so. Printing in the U.S. market, for argument's sake, versus being in Asia or Milan. He asks, is it worth it? And I think his answer is in part, and I just want to bounce this off you, is that what you're giving publishers in this package is the ability to balance time, cost of all sorts, and emissions versus just time and cost. Is that a fair summary?
That is a fair summary. We talked about it earlier, being ESG being somewhat politicized, and it really comes down to a combination of personal points of views and the business point of view. What does the business how do they sort of visualize ESG? What's the value of reducing emissions to that individual or to that business? And it's politicized because we all have different views. But for those that see the benefit, given the long term and what we want the world to look like, typically determines the decisions we make. Likewise, when we see what the competition is doing and those that may be more entrepreneurial or more visionary. Whoever thought the internet and e-commerce would have been what it is today 20 years ago? Nobody quite thought we'd have a lot less smaller buildings and these huge, massive Amazon type buildings around the world. But Jeff Bezos and others had the vision years ago to introduce e-commerce, and now it's pretty much the lion's share of our retail in the country. So it really comes down to personal choice and views on what we believe the world should look like for our grandchildren, effectively.
A question probably best positioned, at least to start with, Sam. You talked about using agreed upon factors to derive CO2 equivalents. I think that's an approach that people don't necessarily understand. They might look at that table that shows all the things you have to consider and be somewhat overwhelmed. How does the use of essentially proven quantities simplify and make it this data more both accessible and available?
Yeah, so I think that the level of data that is available that we can provide, say, yeah, you're right, it can be overwhelming. And I think what often I'll do when I have a consultancy call with a client and go through the reports we offer is I'll try to go back to the basic steps. And similarly how I sort of showed it today, breaking it down one by one, that works really well. But what we can also do is just say to them, okay, in total, your air freight was 20 tons, your ocean freight was 5 tons, and your road freight was 3 tons. And if we can give them that as a start point and give them that really, really top level, then it's up to them to decide, okay, that's all I need for now. It helps me to just focus where I want to make a reduction initially. And then you go step by step through that process. I think you're right, though, that this idea of like the emissions breakdown table that I showed with all of the different types of emissions is completely, I think, overwhelming. But that's where CO2 equivalent, that idea of that process works really, really well. And if you're talking about things like offsetting or choosing to make commitments to reducing emissions by going down the SBTI route that I mentioned, then all of that is done using that currency. And that's kind of what it is. It's a currency that you use when you talk about carbon now. And as long as you can align everything that you're trying to do around your scope 1, 2, 3 and emission reduction, all of that, as long as it sort of comes back to that CO2e figure, then it will work, and it will be something that is transferable between different industries and certainly different companies.
Yeah, we've been struggling a little bit. This is not a sustainability initiative on our part, but we've been trying to figure out a way to talk about forecasting demand, forecasting inventory and supply, which ultimately does kind of factor into some of the things you think about. But it's hard to find that least common denominator. We've had a real advantage in that one of our member presses, Princeton University Press, is both contributing its perspective and some of its data to answer core questions and help us simplify that conversation. So a question as well that, and you may not have the data, but if you do, it'd be great to hear from it. E-commerce itself, is it increasing emissions per unit because you get essentially more local delivery that you're not consolidating?
Tricky one. And no, I don't have data off the top of my head or presently available. I think talking about e-commerce and this idea of the final mile delivery, we have done some work and looking at kind of building that into the carbon reporting tools. And certainly what we're seeing is that when goods are kind of taken to these localized distribution points and then spread out from there, it can make a huge difference if they really optimize that process and think about exactly the exact correct distribution point that it should be taken to, say DHL or DPD, one of the big guys. If they are able to take it to the closest distribution point and then take it from there on a really low carbon solution, like a bike or even walking, fantastic. I mean, there's a really good example. I believe it was DHL that started to bring goods in the UK via boat down the Thames to a central location in the centre of London, and then via bike transport out there from that point to the final destinations, to individuals' front doors. And that worked really well, and it's a really interesting innovation that they kind of developed. And I think it's things like that maybe where we can start to think about really, really strong e-commerce solutions. But ultimately, you're right, when we're packaging individual things and shipping them across the globe, it's inevitably going to create more emissions than if you're bulking everything together and consolidating like we spoke about and moving it in one lot.
So it kind of in a sense, the consumer has a choice there as well.
Yeah, exactly.
Well,
So
we can look at it a couple of ways. If I wanted to purchase that bicycle and that bicycle was manufactured in China, I have the option of purchasing that bicycle from China and having it shipped from China to my door. Thus, encouraging a huge value of emissions for that one bike. If I place that bike in a ocean container with 1,000 other bikes, we've then got the sole emissions cost of that container moving from China to the USA. One can then argue it then gets delivered to 100 different homes or 1,000 different homes. Everyone buys a bike each. But that local distribution, the emissions being incurred on that local emissions, on that local final mile, is going to be a whole lot less than from China to final door USA.
I want to address some kind of basic points, Brian, if I can.
Okay.
The packing that Sam was talking about with the corrugate and the recycled wrap, that is something super simple, or maybe I'm oversimplifying it. It would be relatively easy for the publishers to address corrugate packing with specifically printers coming out of China and this kind of wrap. You'd get rid of the dunnage, the pallets, the bands. I've seen it done successfully for the last 7 years with no damage on heavy books. Couple of forwarders started doing it. There are 2 of the big 5 that do distribution that have to have cross-dock operations to address bands and tops. And that's creating more emissions with the more handling. So I think publishers should really look at packaging, and it can even be worth, when Sam has time, we could do another brief webinar just on packaging. What Adrian brought up about the drop shipping from China and then shipping back out to Asia. When I first started at Woodland, I went into our very large Hayes warehouse, and I could see the amount of books it had shipped in with competitors from China that were going back out to Singapore, Jakarta, Manila, Taiwan. I mean, forecasting, Brian, for publishers would be, how do we drop ship directly what we have to manufacture in Europe and China and not drag it to the US and then ship it all the way back? I mean, that is endemic in publishing. So those are 2 things I think we could focus on as a supply chain committee. Get the right parties that would be able to talk about that.
Agreed. Actually, our supply chain chair contributed the thought that you're making a great case for innovation in logistics, with the importance of trying to take things to the next level, to integrate the data that's available from publishers, distributors, retailers in the supply chain, whether it's in a single market like the US or globally, and then figure out how to optimize across multiple pieces: time, cost, and emissions, or three of those variables. One thing I wanted to come back to, and maybe for Sam, as we get close to wrapping up, could you talk a bit more about EcoVardis? You mentioned it just in passing at the end. What is it, and
Sure.
And how do you use it?
Yeah, so EcoVardis is a third-party accreditation that any company in any sector can get. So the way it works is that you complete, I think it's about 200 questionnaire that assesses 4 key areas. So you've got the environmental, labor and human rights, ethics, and sustainable procurement. Once you've kind of entered all of your information, you might provide your environmental policy, you might provide your labor policies, and anything to do with how you manage your staff, HR policies, all of that goes straight to them. They assess all of that. They also use kind of a very clever AI tool that deep dives and looks through the internet of all of the sort of news articles that have been produced about your company in the last year, and pulls all that data together, does a very complex sort of calculation tool, and give you a final score. Now that final score, if I believe, if it's above a 50 out of 100, you get bronze, 60 is a silver, 70 is a gold, and I believe it goes all the way up to platinum, which is a fantastic tool. Now, what's starting to happen, as I mentioned, is that customers are saying, okay, well, we're looking at our sustainable procurement. It's one of the 4 factors of EcoVardis, and what we're seeing from that, and what the advice that's coming out the back of doing that sort of scoring process, because they'll give you some pointers on ways you can improve, is that we should be really asking those ESG topics and looking at what our suppliers are doing in those spaces. So are they offering alternative fuels? Are they choosing to be more environmentally friendly in the way they run their warehouses? And if they are doing that, and that score system comes through again, honestly, then what they'll find is that slowly and surely, year on year, as they resubmit, because you have to resubmit annually, they'll start to see their own score improve, and hopefully the sort of emission impact coming up and down their own supply chain in the ways that they're running their sites, those other social and governance topics around, are you ensuring that you're not encouraging things like corruption and bribery within your supply, within your company, all of those things start to improve with time. And that's ultimately what EcoVardis does. It's an assessment for that and gives a very transparent but easy to understand score on where a business is and where perhaps they've got improvement to make.
Well, I'm sure we could probably spend another hour just kind of going through some of the metrics, but this is the time that we've agreed to take you. You're already at the end of your day based in the UK. Sam, thank you. Craig, thank you as well for giving us the overview. And Adrian and Susie, thank you for making the time and for being part of this conversation. I'm sure we'll be doing a lot more, not just with Woodland, but also on the topic of sustainability going forward. It's only going to grow over time. So we look forward to seeing you both in our committees and hopefully at our annual meeting in a few weeks.
Thank you very much.
Thank you to you, Brian, for allowing us the opportunity to illustrate our perspective as far as the ESG is concerned. Thank you.
All right, take care.